Alright, so today we are looking at a Sensit 2 AMS cold food machine with a slightly newer refrigeration deck installed. We're going to be swapping out the deck today. It was determined on the last visit that the old deck was low on refrigerant. So, first thing we'll do is we'll unplug at least the bottom shelf, if not the bottom two. Usually you can get away with just the bottom shelf. Go ahead and unload. Depending on what's in it, you can just pull the shelf out, but when it's full of Red Bull like that, it tends to get pretty heavy. You definitely want to remove it. Now we'll go ahead and lift up the entire shelf, and these ones come out fairly easily. Just got to make sure that when you pull it out, the cable doesn't get hooked on anything. So we don't want to rip off that plug. So we go ahead and take it and set it over here. Go ahead and check the machine for any errors and clear them. That way, if we're working on it, it's not going to be beeping at us. All right. So, we're also going to go ahead and probably... we'll see. Might not remove that. Looks like it's just loose. Just needs a new screw. But anyway, let's get the stuff off of the shroud. We're going to be removing the entire shroud today. Go ahead and break out our drill. We'll be using a 3/8 attachment, or 3/8 socket attachment. So there's 2 bolts down here, 1 bolt on the side, and 2 in the very back you can see on those tabs. First thing we'll do, take all of them out. Okay, that done. Just got to remove the 1/4-inch self tapper holding, there's 2 of them, holds the bracket down for the temperature sensor. And to make sure you have no power, you can hit that switch. But, well, alright. So Not super advised to lift up on those. However, just kind of lift it up and work it out. And cool, that fell again. Definitely going to have to put another screw in there to keep it from going anywhere. Oh, this thing is irritating. There we go. Finally. Okay. Oh, what did I do? Okay, there we go. Oh, maybe, yeah, okay. There we go. We're gonna put a new self-tapper in there. Alright, now we gotta work on the rest of this guy. Go and set up our light. Things a bit dirty, but it's not bad. There's 2 more bolts here. And there's probably going to be 1 or 2 possibly in the back. Those can be irritating, to say the least. So, with that, we'll move you guys up here. Sorry, and I gotta block the camera here for a minute. There's 1 in the back corner there. Should be based on how it's pulling. It's in that left-hand side there. Look back there. We'll put the socket on an extension. Is there another one? So really quick running around and popping off the back grate. So that way I can look and see if there's any bolts that I'm missing in the back of the deck. Alright, now that we've identified everything we need to, we are going to go ahead and start removing the evaporator section. On top of the evaporator, there is a piece of sheet metal that holds, I mean, if it's new, it most likely has all 8 or so of its screws. If it's been replaced, most likely it's half or lower than half. But we also can't get to the screws holding the evaporator in the back until we remove that sheet. And to make it easier for a couple of these screws, we're going to go ahead and pop off this side of the shelf bracket. So I'm just going to move a little bit of this out of the way, and we can get to the two screws that hold the front of the evaporator in. And there's either one, or if it's new, two on the other side. Just gotta block the camera a little bit to get back there. Right. Now we should be evaporator free. Just unplug the deck. Then kind of get your harness out of the way, extra wires out of the way. You can bend the copper slightly as long as you do not kink it. The moment you kink it, the deck is ruined. So just be careful whenever you're moving a refrigeration deck. So the easiest place to grab these AMS ones is right in the back of the condenser shroud. Right there, you can bend the copper a bit so it's a little bit easier to hold as one big unit. Then we'll go ahead and slide this guy out. This machine is pretty old, so there's a couple of things that are a little dirtier than I would like, but it is what it is. It's mostly just going to be dust from over time. So we'll go ahead and slide the grate back into place. As long as it is mostly in place. Let's see if we can throw in maybe a self-tapper. Or maybe push that a little bit. But, I mean, reality is that grate is just a mesh filter. So, it's not going to stop everything. So we'll set that aside and we'll grab the new one and go ahead and slide it in. biggest thing is to make sure that there's nothing getting pinched in the back when you press it in. Then you gotta make sure that the drain hose goes into the drip tray. And on AMS, the new decks do not come with their own drip trays. You have to remove the drip tray from the old one and move it over to the new deck. In this case, we're using a refurbed deck because we didn't have any new ones, and at a mill, you don't really use a refurb. Or you don't really use a new one, you use a refurb. Alright, so we made sure that the drip tray, or the drip hose is in the tray, and make sure that the cord is out of the way, and then we can go ahead and push the deck back up. Make sure it's all the way up in there. Now, pretty much insulation is the opposite of the reverse. Getting the screws back into the evaporator is going to be a little bit of a challenge, but just take your time. Be aware that you're probably going to drop them a couple of times. We'll go ahead and move our light. This will be easier to see. Sorry, gotta block the camera again for a second. I'm gonna get in the back here. Put the screw into the evaporator. The reason these screws in the evaporator are so important is that, for one, it helps keep airflow directed through the fins instead of leaking through the side, but also it keeps the evaporator about 1/4 of an inch off of the tray below it, and that's important for condensation flow and to keep anything from freezing. One of the major issues with these machines when they're in a mill setting like this is that dust will get inside from the drivers reloading the machine over and over again, and the dust will build up in that drip tray, and the drain hose will eventually clog. When that happens, the water builds up in the tray and gets up to where it's touching the fins, and the moment the unit kicks back on to cool everything down, the evaporator gets cold enough to frost over, and that's cold enough to freeze water. And once it does that, the condensation, it'll actually freeze the water under it, creating a block. And then when it does its next cycle, the condensation that's on the fins will have nowhere to go and will continue to build up until the evaporator itself is a giant block of ice. So it is very important to keep the evaporator a little bit off of the drip tray underneath of it. All right, now with all of our bolts back into place, we are nearing the end. We'll go ahead and put our shroud up above, which that guy is super important to keep the airflow directed through the fins. We'll do that, and then all of the screws that we have left over will go into it. All right, so now everything's plugged in, everything's screwed down, everything is down and out of the way. So here's another important piece. On the back of the shroud, there are always two, on at least the Sensit 2 and Sensit 3, but for the Epic decks, there are 2 notches on the back side of that shroud. One notch is for the condenser coil line that goes through, and the other is for the cord and the drip tray line to go through. It is important that both of those notches have stuff going through them, and that nothing is jammed above or below the notches, otherwise you won't get a good seal. If you don't get a good seal, all the hot air that goes through that condenser will fill the chamber and cause eventually a freeze up. On the new ones, tends to be a little easier, but You always want to double check, make sure that it's all the way back. So we'll go ahead and put our bolts back into the shroud. Because the way these units work is the compressor and the condenser are put together on one deck, and the evaporator is its own thing. You never want to mix the two. The condenser is where the hot gas goes, because the way the refrigerant works is the compressor pushes it as a liquid through the evaporator. That's where it freezes. Then it moves over and goes through a separate compartment in the compressor, picking up the heat from the compressor. Then it takes that heat as it evaporates and gets pushed through the condenser coil. And there's a fan that pulls air from outside the machine through the condenser coil and out to the back of the machine. That's what keeps the compressor cooled down, and then the refrigerant liquefies again as it cools down, and it goes back to the compressor to be pushed as cold refrigerant. So the shroud is to keep the hot condenser air from interfering with the rest of the refrigeration system. So we'll go ahead and pop this shelf back in now that everything is, or at least the bracket, now that everything is set. Just gotta put that screw in that we pulled out earlier. And that should be pretty much it for fasteners. Go ahead and look over everything, make sure. Now we'll go ahead and put our shelf back in. Today I had Kyle with me to help. And while I was working on the removal and installation of the deck, he was working on one of the coffee machines. Now when we route this cable, gotta make sure all of the excess is pushed out behind it. That way when the driver opens and closes it, it doesn't get caught on anything or smashed, because those wires are a very small gauge. We don't need them getting big. Alright, and we'll set our drill over to the side as we are done with it. All we gotta do is grab the rest of our cans and reload that shelf. So we'll go and pull it out just as a driver normally would. And whenever I unload, I always stack the cans in the order that they go, from left to right or right to left. That way you just know when you put them back in where they're supposed to be. Makes it a ton easier. Alright, and then all we do is go ahead and close her up. Make sure there's no errors, because a lot of times when you leave them open or do work on them, there's an error when you first close it. So we'll go ahead and clear that, and then hit the machine, close the machine again, make sure. No errors. We go ahead and tighten her down. And on these, you always want it to be doesn't have to be super cranked down tight. It just needs to be nice and snug. And there you go.